Remember, like, in Moana when the ocean just, like, sparkles and shimmers so realistically, or in Frozen when Elsa's ice palace just seems to glow? That, my friend, is the magic of physically based rendering. And you've been digging into how Disney's been pushing the boundaries of this tech. So today we're diving into some research papers and presentations, zeroing in on those aha moments that changed the game.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how these techniques have evolved, to create the incredible visuals we see in animation today.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Like, what even is a BRDF? It stands for Bidirectional Reflectance Distribution
It's a
Function.
mouthful, right?
It's a mouthful, but
Uh,
imagine shining a flashlight on anything really, a brick wall, a car, a pane of glass. That way that light bounces off how it scatters and reflects. That's what the BRDF helps us understand and recreate digitally.
yeah, it's essentially a way to describe the appearance of a material, like mathematically, based on how it interacts with light.
Hmm.
And Disney's been on this mission to develop like their own super efficient BRDF.
And they totally did with Wreck-It Ralph back in 2012. I mean, who knew that film would be such a rendering revolution, right? But think about it. They needed a way to create so many different looks.
Yeah, from the shiny plastic of the arcade cabinets to the fuzzy felt of Fix-It Felix Jr. That's pretty incredible.
It's amazing.
And their BRDF was really a game changer in terms of like simplicity and versatility.
Yeah.
It let them create a huge range of materials with this impressive realism, and they even used it successfully in Frozen a couple years later.
Which, again, visually stunning. But this is where things get even more interesting. Back then, effects like light going through glass, or scattering beneath the surface of the skin, those were all handled totally separately from the BRDF. It's almost like they were adding layers in Photoshop. You have the base image, and then you add on those special effects later.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. But rendering technology was advancing, and with Big Hero 6, Disney moved to path-traced global illumination. And that approach needed an upgrade.
Path-traced global illumination, that sounds intense.
It is pretty next level. It's
Yeah.
all about simulating light in a much more realistic way. Like imagine light bouncing around a room, reflecting off multiple surfaces before it reaches your eye. That's what they're trying to recreate with path tracing.
Okay, so light doesn't just travel in a straight line. It bounces around and interacts with everything.
Exactly. But to make that work realistically, they needed a more accurate and unified way to describe how light behaves when it hits a surface. And not just how it reflects, but also how it might be transmitted through the material as well.
Okay, so new and improved model time.
Exactly.
Okay.
Enter the Disney BSDF, the bidirectional scattering distribution function.
BSDF, so it's like the BRDF's cooler, older cousin.
You could say that. So the BRDF only considers reflection right, but the BSDF accounts for both reflection and transmission. And that paints a much more complete picture of how light interacts with the material.
So we're going beyond the surface now. We're talking about how light behaves inside the material itself.
You got it. And that's where things start to get really, really exciting because this shift unlocked a whole new level of realism in animation, like those underwater scenes in Finding Dory, where the light filters through the water,
Yeah.
creating those like rippling, shimmering patterns. That's specular transmission, and the Disney BSDS captures it beautifully.
Oh yeah, it's true. Those underwater scenes were incredible. You can practically feel the light filtering down through the kelp forests.
And the key to that realism is how the BSDF handles refraction. It uses what's called the relative index of refraction, or IOR.
IOR.
Yeah, it determines how much light bends when it passes from one material to another, so like from air to water.
Right, so the IOR is basically telling you how optically dense a material is. Like glass has a higher IOR than air, which is why light bends more when it enters a glass of water.
You got it. And to test how their BSDF was doing, they used something called the furnace test.
Furnace test. That sounds a little intense.
Well, it's not quite as dramatic as it sounds, but imagine a scene that's lit completely evenly from all directions,
Right.
like the inside of a furnace.
Okay. I'm picturing it.
If a material is perfectly energy conserving, meaning it doesn't create or destroy light, it should basically disappear in that environment.
Because it's reflecting and transmitting the same amount of light that it's receiving, so it just blends in.
Exactly. But they found something interesting when they started applying this test to the BSDF. Rough surfaces weren't passing as realistically as they expected.
Rough surfaces.
Yeah, like brushed metal or certain fabrics. They had that kind of subtle roughness to them.
Right.
And they were appearing a little too dark in the furnace test, meaning they weren't reflecting enough light.
So how did they fix that?
They introduced a sheen parameter to the BSDF. It's a way to fine-tune how much light is reflected at grazing angles.
Raising angles.
Yeah, those angles where the light just kind of skims the surface.
Okay, so they added a bit of sheen to make those rough surfaces pop a bit more in the furnace test?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a great example of how you sometimes need to find that sweet spot between physical accuracy and visual plausibility.
I like that visual plausibility.
Because in the real world, those rough surfaces might scatter a tiny bit more light than a purely physical model would predict. And that subtle sheen helps capture that visual nuance.
It's all about the details.
It is, and it doesn't stop there. Another key improvement in the Disney BSDF was using the full Fresnel equations for calculating reflectance.
Fresnel equations ring a bell. They describe how much light is reflected versus refracted at a surface, right?
That's right. And before, they were using the Schlick approximation, which is a simpler way to do it. But for the BSDF, they went all in on accuracy, especially for materials with an IOR close to one like ice and water.
Because those subtle differences in IOR can have a big impact on how the material looks.
Exactly.
Especially in those delicate translucent materials.
Speaking of translucency, we can't forget subsurface scattering.
Oh, right. Subsurface scattering, that's what gives skin that soft, luminous quality. Or makes jade look like it's glowing from within.
Exactly. Now, older subsurface scattering models often made some assumptions that weren't always true,
Like
assuming a surface was flat and infinitely thick.
which isn't true for most things. So a sphere would look like a flat plane?
It's not very realistic. So for the Disney BSDF, they developed a normalized diffusion model. Imagine shining a focused beam of light into a material like marble. The normalized diffusion model approximates how that light scatters and spreads out beneath the surface, and then bounces back out.
Okay, so it's simulating the light bouncing around inside the material, not just on the surface.
You got it, and it was a big improvement in terms of efficiency, but it still had limitations, especially when dealing with really complex geometry, like deep folds in fabric or wrinkles in skin.
Because the path of the light would be way more complicated?
Exactly.
So what did they do?
Well, for Frozen Fever, they actually implemented path-traced subsurface scattering for even greater realism, especially in those close-up shots of Anna and Elsa.
Wow, so you can see every detail in their skin. It's incredible how they keep pushing the boundaries, but I imagine even thin, almost translucent materials like leaves or paper, those must be tricky.
You're right, they need a special approach, because the light travels a much shorter distance inside the material.
So you're essentially dealing with light entering and exiting at almost the same point on the surface?
Yeah.
So how do you even begin to simulate that?
Well, they developed this clever way to blend diffuse and specular transmission to capture that balance of light passing through and reflecting off those really thin surfaces. And they actually made a pretty surprising discovery in the process.
A discovery! Okay, now I have to know.
They found that sometimes transmission through a thin surface could actually be less blurry than reflection.
Really?
Yeah, depending on the IOR of the material.
That's pretty counterintuitive. You'd think the light scattering through the material would make it more blurry.
You would. But it
So-
turns out that the IOR can sometimes counteract that blurring effect.
Wow, it's amazing how much physics is involved in all of this.
It is.
So how did they account for that in the BSDF?
They came up with a way to adjust the perceived roughness of the transmission based on the IOR. Again, striking that balance between physical accuracy and what looks right.
Right, because at the end of the day, it needs to be visually convincing. But let's talk about how this incredible technology actually gets into the hands of the artists.
That's where Layer Lab comes in.
Layer Lab. Okay, I like the sound of this.
It's a tool that Disney developed.
So is it like a digital art studio where artists can build these complex materials layer by layer?
That's a great way to put it. Imagine you're trying to create a polished metal teapot with a lacquer coating. Layer Lab lets artists do just that.
Wow. So they can combine all these different materials with their own unique properties.
Mm.
The reflectivity of the metal, the translucency of the lacquer.
Yes, and see how light interacts with the whole layered structure.
That's amazing.
And it's all based on the physics of light transport. Layer Lab uses something called linear transport theory.
Linear transport theory, what does that even mean?
It basically helps calculate how light behaves as it bounces between all these different layers, taking into account all those internal scattering events.
So it really is like a virtual laboratory.
Yeah, where they can experiment with all these different materials and see how they interact with light in real time.
That's pretty cool. But did they just rely on intuition to build this thing, or did they actually test it out, make sure it was accurate?
Oh, they definitely put it to the test. They compared their results with actual scientific data on multiple scattering.
So they were serious about this.
Yeah. They wanted to make sure Layer Lab wasn't just making pretty pictures. It had to be grounded in real physics.
So they found a way to bridge the gap between like cutting-edge science and artistic vision.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Disney's work so impressive.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like this whole quest for realistic rendering is like, it's never really over, is it? They're always pushing the boundaries.
You're absolutely right. Even with all the breakthroughs we've talked about, the research is ongoing. Like Disney's already exploring things like energy-conserving microsurface scattering.
Energy conserving microsurface scattering. Okay, tell me more about that.
We talked about how microfacet models, while great for detail, can sometimes lose a bit of energy.
Right, because of those little shadows between the microfacet.
Exactly, and this new research is all about addressing that, developing even more sophisticated models that conserve energy even better.
So even the tiniest details, those microscopic interactions of light, matter.
They do. It's all part of this constant drive to create images that are not just visually stunning, but also grounded in the real world.
It's incredible. So as we kind of wrap up here, what's your big takeaway from all of this? What should we be thinking about when we see these amazing lifelike scenes on screen?
I think it's important to appreciate the artistry and the ingenuity behind it all. It's really a testament to human curiosity and creativity and this desire we have to understand and recreate the world around us.
Well said. I love that. It's like this perfect fusion of art and science, pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible.
And the journey's not over yet.
That's the really exciting part. So next time you're watching Moana and you see that incredible sunset, or the way light plays on Elsa's ice crystals in Frozen, just remember the technology and the artistry that went into creating those moments. It's pretty magical.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of physically based rendering. Thanks for joining us.